The year is 64 AD. Emperor Nero stands in the smoldering ruins of Rome, watching half the city burn. The Great Fire has consumed entire districts, homes, temples, markets reduced to ash and bone. Reconstruction will cost a fortune Rome doesn't have. The treasury is drained. Military campaigns in Britannia and Judea bleed gold every month. The Praetorian Guard demands bonuses. The mob demands bread and circuses. And Nero, ever the showman, demands his golden house, a sprawling palace complex covering 300 acres of prime Roman real estate. So Nero does what desperate rulers have done throughout history. He cheats. He calls in the mint masters and gives a simple order: reduce the silver content of the denarius. Not dramatically, just enough that no one will notice immediately. Shave off 5%, maybe 10%. Melt down the old coins, mix in cheaper copper, restrike them with the imperial seal. Same coin, same value declared by law, but less actual silver. The difference goes into Nero's pocket, and Rome gets its golden house. This is the moment. This single decision. This is when Rome begins its long, inevitable slide into economic oblivion. Not when the Goths cross the Danube. Not when the Vandals sack the city. But here, in 64 AD, when an emperor discovers he can print money out of thin air. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what the Roman denarius meant. It wasn't just currency, it was trust made tangible. For over 2 centuries, since Augustus established the silver standard, a denarius contained roughly 4.5 grams of pure silver. That consistency made it the dollar of the ancient world. Merchants in Alexandria accepted it. Germanic tribes hoarded it. Persian traders waited and nodded in approval. The denarius represented Roman power, but more than that, it represented Roman honesty. When you held a denarius, you held a promise that Rome would honor its value. Augustus understood this. He inherited a republic torn apart by civil war and economic chaos. Julius Caesar had debased the currency to pay his legions. Mark Antony flooded the East with inferior coins. The Roman economy was a disaster, trust shattered, trade collapsing. So Augustus did something radical. He fixed the silver content and kept it fixed. For his entire 40-year reign, a denarius was a denarius. Predictable, reliable, boring. And boring is exactly what a good currency should be. Under Augustus and his immediate successors, Rome flourished. Not because of military conquest, though there was plenty of that, but because economic stability allowed complexity to thrive. A merchant in Gaul could contract with a supplier in Syria knowing the payment would hold its value for months. A soldier could save his salary, knowing it would buy the same amount of bread next year. Credit markets developed. Long-distance trade exploded. The Roman economy became integrated, sophisticated, and utterly dependent on one thing: trust in the denarius. But empires are expensive. Staggeringly, unsustainably expensive. Rome in the 1st century AD maintained a professional standing army of roughly 300,000 men. These weren't citizen soldiers who farmed in peacetime. They were full-time warriors expecting regular pay, retirement bonuses, and land grants. The annual military budget consumed 60 to 70% of imperial revenue. Then came the infrastructure: aqueducts, roads, ports, forts stretching from Scotland to Syria. Then the bureaucracy: governors, tax collectors, judges, engineers. Then the subsidies: free grain for Rome's million inhabitants, spectacular games, public baths, temples. All of this required enormous tax revenue flowing into Rome from every corner of the empire. But Roman taxation was wildly inefficient and corrupt. Provincial governors extracted what they could, skimmed plenty for themselves, and sent the remainder to Rome. Rich senators owned vast estates but paid minimal taxes, their wealth protected by political connections. The burden fell heaviest on the class that could least afford it: small farmers, tradesmen, the working backbone of the empire. And then there was the fundamental problem: Rome had stopped expanding. For centuries, Roman growth followed a simple model: conquer new territory, loot its wealth, enslave its population, establish it as a tax base, then use those resources to conquer the next territory. It was a Ponzi scheme that worked brilliantly as long as expansion continued. But by the mid-1st century, Rome had reached its natural limits. The Germanic forests offered little wealth and fierce resistance. Persia was too strong to conquer. The Sahara and the Atlantic Ocean were impassable barriers. Rome now had to maintain its massive military and administrative structure without the constant influx of plunder and slaves that had funded it. The math didn't work. It never would again. Nero's solution, debase the currency, was brilliant in its simplicity and catastrophic in its consequences. By reducing silver content from 100% to 93%, he effectively created 7% more coins from the same amount of metal. Instant revenue. No new taxes. No angry mobs. Just alchemy performed at the imperial mint. For a few years, it worked. The difference was small enough that most people didn't notice. Merchants still accepted denarii at face value. Soldiers still took their pay. The economy continued functioning. Nero built his golden house. Rome rose from the ashes more spectacular than before. But some people noticed. Wealthy Romans who dealt in large quantities of silver began weighing coins. Merchants doing international trade found that foreign traders grew suspicious, testing coins more carefully. Gresham's law, though it wouldn't be named for another 15 centuries, began its inexorable work. Bad money drives out good. Citizens hoarded older, purer coins and spent the debased ones. The better currency disappeared into private hoards while the inferior currency flooded the market. And future emperors, seeing Nero's trick, drew the obvious conclusion. If debasing the currency worked once, it could work again. After Nero came the year of the 4 emperors, civil war, chaos, competing claimants buying loyalty with promises and silver. Vespasian restored order and actually tried to stabilize the currency. But his sons, Titus and Domitian, faced the same pressures: military expenses, building projects, the endless appetite of a Roman state. The real acceleration began under Trajan. Here was Rome's Optimus Princeps, the best emperor, celebrated then and now for his military victories, grand constructions, and enlightened rule. Trajan conquered Dacia, bringing Romania's gold and silver mines under Roman control. Temporary wealth poured into the treasury. Trajan built his famous column, his massive forum, his markets. He expanded the grain dole. He lowered taxes. He was beloved. He was also short-sighted. Trajan spent the Dacian windfall immediately. There was no sovereign wealth fund, no long-term planning. He treated a one-time resource boom as permanent revenue and structured the empire's budget accordingly. When the Dacian mine's production declined, as all mines eventually do, Rome faced an even larger gap between revenue and expenses. And the denarius, under Trajan's successors, continued its slow degradation. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, the Stoic sage who wrote Meditations, even he couldn't resist. Barbarian invasions, plague devastating the population, military campaigns draining resources. Marcus needed money, so the silver content dropped further. By his death in 180 AD, the denarius contained about 75% silver. Still recognizable as silver currency, but the decline was unmistakable. Then came the Severan dynasty, and debasement became policy. Septimius Severus seized power through civil war in 193 AD. His advice to his sons was brutally pragmatic: enrich the soldiers and scorn all others. He understood that imperial power rested on military loyalty, and loyalty was purchased with silver. So he gave the legions massive pay raises, the first significant increase in over a century. Soldiers went from 300 denarii per year to 450, then to 600 under his son Caracalla. Where did this money come from? Not from economic growth, not from new conquests, from debasement. Septimius reduced the denarius to 50% silver. Half the coin was now copper and bronze. Caracalla continued the policy, even as he extended Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, partly for idealistic reasons, mostly to expand the tax base. But citizenship without economic opportunity meant little. The empire wasn't creating wealth, it was destroying the mechanism by which wealth could be measured and exchanged. By 235 AD, the denarius contained 35% silver, and then the crisis of the 3rd century began. What followed was 50 years of near-total collapse. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome had over 50 emperors, most lasting less than 2 years before being assassinated or dying in civil war. Armies in different provinces declared their generals emperor and marched on each other. The Persians invaded the east, capturing the Emperor Valerian, the most humiliating defeat in Roman history. Germanic tribes poured across the Rhine and Danube. Plague returned, killing millions. Trade routes disintegrated. Cities shrank. The population declined. And through it all, emperors kept debasing the currency because they had no choice. Each short-lived ruler needed to pay his soldiers immediately. There was no time for tax reform, no opportunity for economic restructuring. The only lever available was the mint. By 260 AD, the silver content of the denarius had fallen to 5%. It was barely silver at all, a copper coin with silver plating that rubbed off in normal use, revealing the base metal underneath. The economic consequences were predictable and devastating. Merchants stopped accepting denarii at face value, demanding payment in gold, goods, or older coins. The price of staple goods exploded. An Egyptian papyrus from 250 AD shows wheat prices had increased 50-fold in 30 years. A loaf of bread that cost half a denarius in 200 AD cost 100 denarii by 270 AD, and that's assuming you could find anyone willing to sell bread for rapidly depreciating coins. The Roman economy, sophisticated and integrated for 3 centuries, began reverting to barter. A soldier's salary, even if tripled nominally, bought almost nothing. Military units resorted to plundering the territories they were supposed to defend. Farmers stopped growing surplus crops because currency was worthless and taxes were confiscatory. They retreated to subsistence agriculture. Cities couldn't maintain infrastructure. Aqueducts broke, roads crumbled, walls fell into disrepair. Credit markets vanished entirely. Who would lend money when it would be repaid in worthless metal? Long-distance trade collapsed. Why ship goods across the Mediterranean when the payment would be debased coins worth less than the shipping cost? The empire fractured into regional economies, each trying to survive independently. This was the currency death spiral. Debasement caused inflation. Inflation destroyed commerce. Commerce collapse reduced tax revenue. Lower revenue forced more debasement. The cycle accelerated until the currency became meaningless. In 274 AD, Emperor Aurelian attempted reform. He issued new coins with better silver content and tried to restore confidence. It failed. The damage was too deep. No one trusted Roman currency anymore. Trust, once shattered, cannot be decreed back into existence. Then came Diocletian. Diocletian was ruthless, practical, and desperate. He understood Rome needed radical restructuring to survive. So he split the empire into eastern and western halves for administrative efficiency. He quadrupled the size of the army and the bureaucracy. He implemented sweeping tax reforms, attempting to capture revenue that had been evading the imperial system. He created a new currency system with coins of defined metallic content. And when inflation continued spiraling out of control, he did something unprecedented. He issued the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 AD. The edict was extraordinary, a 32-page document fixing maximum prices for over 1,000 goods and services throughout the empire. Wheat, wine, meat, clothing, transportation costs, labor wages, everything controlled by imperial decree. Violators would face execution. It was Roman central planning at its most ambitious. And it failed spectacularly. Price controls cannot override economic reality. When the legal price is set below the market price, goods disappear. Farmers stopped bringing grain to market. Merchants closed shops. Artisans ceased production. A black market exploded, with goods trading at multiples of the official price for those who could access them. The poor, meant to be protected by the edict, starved because legal markets had nothing to sell. Diocletian's price controls lasted barely 2 years before being quietly abandoned. The emperor who had tried to save Rome through authoritarian economics had only accelerated its disintegration. But Diocletian did accomplish one thing. He created the solidus. Constantine, Diocletian's successor, formalized the gold standard with the solidus, a coin containing about 4.5 grams of pure gold. The solidus was magnificent, stable, and utterly irrelevant to ordinary Romans. It was too valuable for everyday transactions. A single solidus could feed a family for months. It was currency for the elite, tax collectors, military commanders, wealthy merchants, foreign trade. For everyone else, the economy continued operating on debased silver and copper coins that fluctuated wildly in value and increasingly on barter. Rome now had a two-tier economic system. The wealthy and powerful dealt in stable gold. Everyone else scrambled for survival in a world of worthless money and vanishing goods. The social consequences were profound. The middle class, small merchants, independent farmers, skilled artisans, was destroyed. Hyperinflation wiped out savings. Confiscatory taxation seized property. Debased currency made commerce nearly impossible. Those who couldn't operate in gold were pushed into poverty or dependence on the wealthy. The Roman Empire increasingly resembled feudalism. Small farmers, unable to pay taxes in worthless currency, turned themselves over to large landowners, becoming coloni, tied to the land, essentially serfs. They surrendered their freedom for protection and economic stability the empire could no longer provide. The great senatorial estates became self-sufficient economic units, mini-kingdoms that produced everything internally and engaged with the broader economy as little as possible. Cities shrank. Why live in a city when currency was worthless, trade had collapsed, and civic institutions couldn't maintain basic services? Urban populations declined by 50 to 70% between 250 and 450 AD. The empire was deurbanizing, decomplexifying, reverting to localized agrarian economies. And the military, that essential pillar of Roman power, was disintegrating. Soldiers in the late empire were no longer the disciplined legions of Augustus. Recruitment had collapsed because citizenship and military service no longer offered meaningful benefits. You couldn't feed your family on debased coins. So Rome increasingly relied on barbarian foederati, Germanic tribes given land and autonomy in exchange for military service. These weren't Roman soldiers defending Rome. They were foreign armies serving their own interests. By the 5th century, Roman armies were commanded by barbarian generals composed of barbarian soldiers fighting for regional warlords who happened to hold Roman titles. Stilicho, Alaric, Ricimer, Odoacer, the men who controlled military force in the Western Empire's final decades were Germanic, not Roman. And their loyalty was to themselves, not to an emperor in Ravenna or Rome. Tax collection, that fundamental function of any state, collapsed entirely. By 450 AD, the Western Roman government could barely collect revenue from Italy, let alone from Gaul, Spain, or Britain. Provinces stopped sending taxes to the center. Regional strongmen kept revenue local. The imperial bureaucracy, unpaid and irrelevant, simply faded away. The Western Roman Empire in its final decades was an empire in name only. It controlled almost no territory directly. It commanded no effective army. It collected minimal taxes. It provided no services. It was a legal fiction maintained by inertia and tradition. When the Gothic general Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476 AD, almost no one cared. There was no great battle, no dramatic siege. Odoacer simply pensioned off the teenage emperor and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring that one emperor was sufficient. The Western Roman Empire ended not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic memo. But Rome had actually died decades earlier, economically, not militarily. The death blow wasn't struck by Goths or Vandals. It was struck by the denarius, melted and debased and recast until it meant nothing. Currency collapse destroyed the economic complexity that made Rome possible. Without reliable money, you can't have long-distance trade. Without trade, you can't have specialization. Without specialization, you can't support cities. Without cities, you can't maintain infrastructure or administration. Without administration, you can't collect taxes or field armies. Without armies, you can't defend borders. It's a cascade, and it flows in one direction, towards simplification, localization, and poverty. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, survived another 1,000 years. Why? Because Constantine's solidus remained stable. Byzantium maintained a gold currency that the world trusted. They could tax effectively, trade internationally, hire armies, and sustain complexity. The solidus made Byzantium possible. The West had no such anchor. The denarius was worthless. The Western economy ran on barter and gold coins no peasant would ever touch. And so the West fragmented into kingdoms ruled by Germanic warlords, the Roman bureaucracy disappeared, literacy collapsed, trade routes vanished, and Europe entered the period that later ages would call the Dark Ages. This wasn't inevitable. Rome didn't fall because barbarians were stronger. Germanic tribes had been pressing Rome's borders for centuries without breaking through. Rome fell because it could no longer organize resources to resist. And it couldn't organize resources because it had destroyed its currency, and with it, the economic system that made Roman power possible. The lesson here is simple and terrifying. Currency debasement is a civilizational poison. It works slowly. The symptoms are gradual. Each emperor's decision seems rational. Just a little less silver, just this once, to solve an immediate crisis. But the cumulative effect is catastrophic. Inflation doesn't just make things more expensive. It destroys the information system that prices provide. It makes planning impossible. It wipes out savings and punishes prudence. It rewards speculation and hoarding. It transfers wealth from productive citizens to those closest to the currency spigot. It collapses trust, and trust is the foundation of everything: commerce, credit, law, government. When trust in currency dies, trust in institutions follows. Why obey laws enforced by a government that steals through inflation? Why pay taxes when the payment is worthless? Why serve in an army paid in debased coins? Why produce surplus when there's no reliable medium of exchange? Every civic virtue that holds a complex society together erodes when money becomes meaningless. Rome's elites understood this intellectually. They weren't stupid, but they faced an impossible dilemma: maintain the empire's size and ambitions or maintain the currency's integrity. They couldn't do both. And when forced to choose, they chose the empire. They chose military pay raises and public games and grand monuments and subsidized grain. They chose short-term stability over long-term survival. And so Rome died. The parallels to the modern world are obvious and uncomfortable. Every major power today runs massive deficits funded by currency creation. The United States has increased its monetary base by trillions in response to successive crises. The Federal Reserve creates dollars electronically. No need for mint masters shaving coins, just keystrokes adding zeros to accounts. Europe, Japan, China, all following similar policies. The justifications sound sophisticated: quantitative easing, monetary stimulus, aggregate demand management. But the underlying mechanic is identical to Nero's: create currency without corresponding wealth creation, and hope no one notices the difference. So far it's worked more or less. Inflation has remained relatively controlled, though recent years have shown cracks in that control. But Rome's debasement worked for a century before the crisis hit. These processes play out over generations, not years. By the time the consequences become undeniable, the policy is too entrenched to reverse. The defenders of modern monetary policy argue it's different now. We have central banks, sophisticated economic models, global reserve currencies, digital systems that allow fine-tuned control. Rome was primitive by comparison. Maybe. Or maybe we're just earlier in the same cycle, telling ourselves comforting stories while the monetary foundations slowly crumble. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And the rhyme scheme here is uncomfortably familiar. Rome believed its currency was special, backed by imperial power, accepted everywhere, integral to the world order. Roman elites couldn't imagine a world without the denarius. Until there was one. What happens when a reserve currency fails? When the global financial system built on that currency unravels? When trade networks designed around one monetary system suddenly need alternatives? We don't know. It's never happened in the modern interconnected world. But Rome offers a preview. Complexity collapses, specialization fails, trade localizes, wealth evaporates, and societies simplify dramatically. The Roman Empire, at its height, was a miracle of organization. A political and economic system spanning millions of square miles and tens of millions of people, maintaining infrastructure, enforcing law, facilitating trade, and defending borders. It took centuries to build. It took one debased coin to begin tearing it down. The denarius under Nero looked almost identical to the denarius under Augustus. Same imagery, same inscriptions, same official value, but 5% less silver. That tiny difference, almost invisible, was the crack in the dam. And once started, it couldn't be stopped. Each emperor widened it further. Each crisis demanded more debasement. The monetary flood built slowly, then all at once. By the time Romans realized their currency was worthless, the institutions that might have saved them were already too weak to act. The empire couldn't reform because it couldn't pay for reform. It couldn't pay for reform because its currency was worthless. It was a trap with no exit. This is what collapse looks like. Not dramatic, not sudden, but grinding and inevitable. Each generation slightly worse off. Each decade's money worth less. Each crisis requiring more extreme measures. The decline is so gradual that people adapt, normalize, and accept conditions their grandparents would have found unthinkable. Until one day you look around and realize the empire is gone. Not conquered, not overthrown, just dissolved into irrelevance. The coin that dealt the final blow to Rome wasn't minted in 476 AD. It was minted in 64 AD, when Nero decided that silver wasn't really necessary for silver coins. Everything after was just consequences playing out across 4 centuries. Empires rise on sound money and discipline. They fall when leaders discover they can print prosperity. Rome learned this lesson the hard way. The question for us is whether we're paying attention. If you found this deep dive into Rome's economic collapse fascinating, this channel has more like it. Untold stories of how empires crumble, how financial systems fail, and how history's greatest powers sowed the seeds of their own destruction. Subscribe for the next one, because the collapse is never where you expect to find it. It's in the details, in the coins, in the tiny decisions that echo across centuries. Rome fell because it debased its currency. The barbarians just picked up the pieces.